and welcome to this video on Unit 6.4, which is all about opposition and resistance in wartime, looking at lots of different groups and then thinking about how effective those forms of opposition were. As always, I'm going to advise you to do a black pen, red pen activity before we get going with this. So just start by writing down everything you can remember about opposition before the war, but also then opposition during the war from young people, the church, civilian and military elites, and the left wing. So an introduction to opposition in wartime. Now, despite the dangers, there were groups and individuals who resisted the Nazi regime in various ways. There was little common ground between these different groups. Some of them were motivated by their political beliefs, others were motivated by moral outrage at some of the Nazi policies, and others just didn't want to conform to the strict social norms. The course of the war and the growing awareness that Germany was heading for defeat from January 1943 was a major factor for undermining faith in the regime and in Hitler himself. Even so, there was still no serious groundswell of opposition to the regime. Opposition was pretty effectively dealt with during the war by the Nazis through their use of terror and repression. Furthermore, none of the regime's critics had broad-based support enough to be able to be a really significant threat to the Nazis. When I go through the different groups, I'm going to be using the same information that I gave you on these cool nail grids from lesson. So you might want to have these out and be highlighting or just following along as we go through it. We're going to start with the elites because to most historians they would argue they posed the most significant challenge to the Nazis during World War II, especially with the July bomb plot. So we're going to start off with thinking about the elites' opposition pre-war. This is a bit of a recap from Unit 4. So the elites generally, we're thinking here about the people that are high up in the military, but also the old conservative elites as well. A lot of them actually shared the same views as Hitler, but disapproved of his methods. The army generally, pre-war, had a tradition of serving whoever was in charge, and therefore opposition would require a major shift in their attitude. Now, on the whole, they were pretty loyal to the Nazis. They liked the fact that Hitler had been rearming in secret from 1933 and openly from 1935. They liked that he'd put so much into that and he'd increased the size of the army significantly. They also enjoyed the early successes of foreign policy, things like getting the Saar back, remilitarizing the Rhineland. That was really popular with the army leaders. But in 1938, there were some senior figures in the army, like the Defence Minister Blomberg, that you can see in that picture there, and the Commander-in-Chief Fritz. They both expressed doubt about foreign policy. That's after a meeting that happened in 1937, where Hitler outlined his plans for Lebensraum to a lot of the military leaders. Now, they were worried about that, and they expressed criticism of that. And as a result, Hitler dealt with them by firing them. Now, he's also weakening the army as a result as well, because he's replacing them with people that are his supporters that are unlikely to criticise his decisions. So according to one historian, the conservative elites who had helped him to the saddle suffered a further loss of influence. It's not just Blomberg and Fritz, but there's also General Beck, who criticises Hitler and feels very worried about the direction of foreign policy. Now, in 1938, over the Sudetenland, General Beck and some other senior figures actually plotted a military coup to get rid of Hitler. They were doing this if they had the support of Britain and France, but Britain and France gave Hitler the Sudetenland during the Munich conference, so this military coup never materialised. We're now going to think about opposition in World War II, and we're first of all going to think about the Kreisau Circle. Now, it's important to see that there is a difference between the civilian elites and the military elites. If they give you an exam question on this, they are likely to mention terms like civilian or military, so it is important that you remember that there's a difference, even though they are both within the elites sheet. So thinking about the Kreisau Circle then. Now, this was a group of people that you can see pictured here that was led by this man here, Count Helmut von Moltke. He was the old sort of aristocratic elite that was leading this group, but it included a wide variety of people, including aristocrats, lawyers, SPD politicians, and even churchmen like Bonhoeffer as well. Now, their motivation for creating this Kreisau Circle was a belief in personal freedom and individual responsibility. They were quite critical of the atrocities committed by German forces, and they disliked Hitler's policies on moral and religious grounds. So what did they actually do then? Well, they were basically a civilian intellectual resistance group, and they held 3 meetings in 1942 to 1943 at the von Moltke estate in Kreisau. So whilst they were there, they were basically discussing non-violent resistance. They don't want to overthrow the Nazis, but they're thinking about how they would help rebuild Germany if the Nazis were overthrown. But obviously for the Nazis, this was seen as serious opposition, and therefore the group was broken up by the Gestapo. The leader of it was arrested and then executed in January 1945. So their activities were seen as treasonous despite not promoting violent overthrow, as the plans rested on an assumption that Germany would lose the war and that the Nazis would be overthrown. The group faltered after their leader's arrest, and most of the members were then arrested after the July bomb plot. Now, Klaus von Stauffenberg was not a member of the Kreisau Circle, but he did have some links to some people in it, and that's why they are seen as a threat after that plot in July 1944, and why a lot of them are executed, and they're part of the 5,746 people that are. So now we're going to think about the military resistance and about the army elites who were involved in some assassination attempts from 1943. Now, 1943 is the key turning point. Remember, this is where we have the defeat at Stalingrad and where we get the start of total war measures. It's the time when many German officers realise that the war is no longer winnable and that Hitler is going to lead them to military failure. Now, there's also some people, not all of them, that were motivated by Nazi crimes, especially in Eastern Europe, that felt that these were morally indefensible. This led to parts of the military resistance to move from opposition and the idea of just a coup to assassination of Hitler directly. Now, they are a significant threat. For a lot of the historians, they would talk about particularly the July plot being the most significant form of opposition to the Nazis. They had access to weapons, and that meant that they had real potential to resist. Furthermore, they're not fully coordinated until 1944. There has been some moves to coordinate them from the Blomberg-Fritz affair in 1937 to 1938, but the army hasn't been fully coordinated until 1944, so they do have a degree of opportunity here up until that point. So there are 2 plots that are very close together, as you can see here. The first one involved the idea of putting a bomb on a plane, and it involved some senior figures in the army. Both of them were officers on the Eastern Front and had seen that brutal fighting and that war of racial annihilation. So they decided to plant a bomb on Hitler's plane. Now, the fuse did work, but the bomb did not go off as it was too cold. Now, what they managed to do was to avoid detection. They managed to retrieve the bomb to avoid being discovered, and they're going to get involved in some later plots as well. A little while later, we have a suicide bomb plot that involves somebody called Colonel von Gersdorf. Now, he was somebody that believed that Hitler really needed to be assassinated, and he was willing to give his life to this to make sure it happened. So he ended up going to the same exhibition that Hitler was going to, where they were looking at captured Soviet weapons. Now, when he's there, he planned this suicide attack, and he was carrying some explosives timed to detonate while Hitler toured the exhibit. However, it failed when Hitler left the exhibition early, and he only narrowly managed to defuse the bomb before it actually then exploded. So again, another failed attempt there. The next example of opposition from the army elites comes from the July bomb plot. Now, this is an absolutely crucial event to know about. It is named on the spec, so you need to make sure that you know this one in some depth. Now, this was a plan that involved people like General Beck and also Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. You only need to know their names. If you can remember the names of other people involved, great, but you do not have to remember them. So this was basically an event that came the closest to killing Hitler. It was a really serious resistance effort in World War II, and most historians would say that this was the most important form of opposition during the war because it came closest to succeeding. Now, the people involved generally had different motivations. Just like with the elites generally, there wasn't one uniting cause and one uniting motivator to get involved in something like this. So, for instance, some people were motivated by their patriotism and the idea of Germany losing the war, and others were more motivated by moral conviction and about the Nazi crimes that were being committed. For instance, Klaus von Stauffenberg is a Catholic, and he said that he was partly motivated by this and about this sort of moral need to get rid of the Nazis based on all the horrors of what they've done. So let's think about what the plan was then. So basically, their plan was that they wanted to assassinate Hitler and then launch a military coup. And they were going to need to get lots of senior army generals on their side to be able to do this. Once they've killed Hitler, they then plan to seize the ministries, radio, and arrest any Nazi leadership. They would then announce the new government over the radio, and then they would create this new government from a range of different parties so that it would be democratic. They then wanted to open immediate peace negotiations with the Western allies. The reality is that they don't quite achieve what they wanted, even though they came quite close to some extent. It could have been successful. So Stauffenberg does manage to plant the briefcase bomb under the table where Hitler is. He then excuses himself, saying that he's got to make an important phone call. And whilst he's gone, somebody decides to make more leg room for themselves. So they move the briefcase to behind a very sturdy, thick wooden block table leg. Now the bomb then explodes, but Hitler managed to survive with only minor injuries. He does get hurt in this though, and it shows the fact that he can be hurt. For instance, Hitler ends up losing some of his hearing as a result of this. So Hitler manages to survive though, even though some other people are killed that are in the room. And it's unlucky that it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. Historians have also looked at other reasons why it didn't go off, and actually they have found out that Stauffenberg might have planned to try and create this very powerful bomb with 2 explosive charges, but actually he was under time pressure and couldn't get both to explode, so he activated only one, which halved the explosive power. And if he hadn't have done that, if he'd managed to get both to explode, it should have done the job of killing Hitler. Regardless of that anyway, there's also some other problems that happen after this as well. So even though the bomb explodes, Hitler does survive. The conspirators then crucially hesitate whilst they're awaiting confirmation of Hitler's death. They don't manage to get control of the radio, and they don't manage to broadcast about Hitler's death. Instead, broadcasts prove that Hitler's actually alive. Now, after that, they basically don't manage to convince more of the army to join them, and so the plot essentially fails. And after this, there is widespread arrests and executions. They arrest 7,000 people and execute 5,746 of them. They also make sure that there's a big show about the rounding up of conspirators, of torture, of show trials, to really try and make sure that nobody else would dare to try and assassinate Hitler after this. And after this as well, the army lost the last vestiges of independence and is effectively now under SS control. So this event, absolutely crucial to know about. Remember that this one comes the closest to killing Hitler than any other attempt, but its failure also highlights how luck, poor coordination, and the strength of the Nazi state undermined even the most serious of resistant efforts. The next opposition group we're going to look at is the youth. So let's just start off with a quick recap of pre-war youth opposition between 1933 and 1939. Now remember that youth opposition is a small section of the youth. The youth generally, at least at the start of when the Nazis first came to power, were very supportive of the regime and its activities. Remember that the historian Wilt estimated that 95% of the youth supported the Nazis. The Nazis wanted to win their hearts and minds, and to some extent they had achieved that. However, by the mid-1930s, there were signs of growing disillusionment, especially due to things like closing down all other youth organisations in 1936 and also making membership to the Hitler Youth compulsory and more militaristic in 1939. So historian Housen said the youth knew no alternative, but despite this, support for Hitler was less than total. So let's think about these smaller sections of the youth that then opposed the Nazis and how they did it. Now notice we've only got the two groups here. The White Rose aren't around pre-war, but we are going to think about the Edelweiss Pirates and the Swing Youth. Now, the Edelweiss Pirates, remember that they are mainly working class people. Their opposition pre-war was kind of anti-social rebelliousness, doing things that the Nazis didn't want them to do, basically refusing to conform to the Nazis' ideal of a young person. So it's not yet political. It's basically about their own autonomy and independence and them just rejecting Nazi ideology, essentially. The Swing Youth were generally middle-class children, and their opposition basically took the form of preferring English and American dance music, about dressing in a way that didn't fit the Nazi ideal. And again, at this point, it's not overtly political or attempting to overthrow the regime. They basically just want this alternative youth culture. Now we need to think about how things changed during the war and the extent of change as well. So if we think about the Edelweiss Pirates first of all, and remember this is a group for the working class youth. Now, obviously they'd been around since pre-war, and they continued in those same areas that they had been in previously. For instance, generally in the sort of industrial areas of things like the Rhineland and the Ruhr. Now, we know already that they are a group that was basically not willing to conform to Nazi ideals. But it's important to just mention as well that these were not one united group. There were lots of different branches which kind of knew themselves or called themselves as the Edelweiss Pirates, but they were not united and therefore they were easily isolated. So in terms of their activities, a lot of their opposition is what they were doing pre-war as well. There isn't a major change for the majority of members of the Edelweiss Pirates. However, there were some increasing clashes with the Hitler Youth groups at this point, especially as propaganda intensified and, significant supporters of the Nazis from the Hitler Youth sections became more frustrated at people that they knew that weren't willing to support the war effort and those sorts of things. So let's think about the really key example of the Edelweiss Pirates and the most significant form of opposition from within that youth organisation. So there was a particular group in Cologne who became linked to an adult underground group that helped people like army deserters, escaped prisoners of war, forced labourers, and also concentration camp prisoners as well. So this is a much more serious form of opposition, really undermining the war effort here. As a result of the seriousness of this opposition, the Nazis didn't want to do their normal thing of doing things like shaving heads or banishing people to labour camps or just arresting them. Instead, they wanted to make a real show of the fact that they wouldn't accept this even from young people. So they had 13 of the leaders of the Cologne group publicly hanged in November 1944, including 6 teenagers. Now, the Nazis did also try and break up as many of these Edelweiss Pirates groups as possible, and in December 1942, they managed to break up 28 groups in cities like Dusseldorf and Essen as well. There's also opposition that continues from the Swing Youth, although this is not as extreme as the examples that we've just seen with the Edelweiss Pirates. So remember, this is the middle class youth that are part of this Swing Youth, that they are generally motivated by a desire to have a good time, and they basically consciously reject Nazi values and moral precepts. So what are they doing? They're doing very much the same thing that they were doing pre-war. So you can talk about all of those same examples. And essentially, they were seen as an ideological deviant by the SS. Now, what doesn't change is their activities. What does change is the way that the state responds to them. As the war is now broken out, as propaganda is getting more extensive, And as they're so worried about keeping unity and about keeping morale high, Himmler decides that he wants to send the leaders to concentration camps for 2 or 3 years due to their so-called sleaziness and unashamed pleasure-seeking. They basically want to round up lots of members of the swing youth and feel that they've got more justification to do this now that the war has broken out. With others, they force them into military service because remember that they're doing things like reducing the age of conscription over time, so they can deal with the threat of youth opposition by sending more and more of them to go and fight as they get older. Now, generally, we wouldn't argue that the swing youth were a substantial threat to the Nazis. They lacked the programme, cells and logistics, and therefore they were only symbolically subversive rather than an actual strategic threat to the Nazis. By the later years of the war, as a result of that harsh repression from people like Himmler as well, the swing youth were less visible than they were, and the movement of the swing youth virtually collapsed as well. The last youth group to know about is the White Rose, a really, really important group for their moral attack on the Nazis. Now, this is a group that wasn't around pre-war. This was a group that was formed in 1942, and it was based in Munich University. It's led by this girl that you can see here, Sophie Scholl, and also her brother, but it was supported by Professor Kurt Huber. Their target audience was the educated middle class, and they began handing out leaflets within Munich University, but then also went into the wider city of Munich as well to have a more substantial impact. They were motivated by the idea of individual freedom and personal responsibility. They had watched the sermons of people like Galen. They had heard about his work, obviously condemning the Nazi policy of euthanasia, and they wanted to show some sort of opposition to the Nazi treatment of Jews and Slavs. So what do then? They basically go beyond mere dissent, and they issue 6 pamphlets which were distributed mainly in Munich, and they also did things like painting anti-Nazi slogans like Hitler mass murderer on buildings in February 1943. Now, they were incredibly brave, but they didn't have very good security measures, and unfortunately, they were caught in February 1943 as well. So 6 leaders were caught by the Gestapo and then publicly put on trial and executed in February 1943. Sophie Scholl stood very bravely, incredible person, and gave a really good speech during her trial when she said, "What we have written and said is in the minds of all of you, but you lack the courage to say it out loud." So another example there of youth opposition, and quite effective, even though it was short-lived. Let's make some conclusions then on World War II youth opposition. So first of all, if we think about the limitations of it, wartime opposition was generally fragmented, localised and lacking political coordination. The wartime conditions, particularly with things like conscription, repression and surveillance, prevented youth resistance from developing into a mass movement capable of challenging the regime. However, there were some positives and there were some successes. The very existence of youth resistance, despite relentless indoctrination through the Hitler Youth and intensified control during total war efforts, highlights the failure of ideological conformity to fully suppress independent thought. So even though they weren't likely to overthrow the regime, it was still crucial in terms of opposition. Moving on now to church opposition and starting with the Protestants. And we want to start by thinking about their pre-war Protestant opposition, which is at the top of your sheet. Now remember that the Nazis created the Reich Church in 1933. This was essentially a Nazified church. As you can see from the picture here, there were lots of swastikas around the pulpits. It was very much Nazified and had rules like the Aryan paragraph put in as well. Now, this was seen as outrageous by some of the Protestant clergy, and they created something called the Pastors' Emergency League in 1933 that then became the Confessional Church by 1934. Now, the Confessional Church is the really key example of resistance pre-war. 5,000 out of 17,000 people that were Protestant church leaders joined this, and they basically were trying to resist state interference in the church, and re-establish theology based on the Bible. They basically didn't want church and state to be united here. Now, this isn't necessarily a sort of outward general opposition to the Nazis. It's more about the idea of Nazis not having control over the church. Some of the individuals that joined the confessional church are people like Bonhoeffer and also Niemöller as well. Now, a lot of these individual Protestant clergy spoke out against the Nazis, but the Nazis just responded with increased repression. So, for instance, by 1937, over 700 Protestant pastors had been imprisoned, including Niemöller. The Nazis also tried to weaken the influence of Christianity by doing things like the Church Succession Campaign, which basically tried to persuade party members of the Nazi Party to renounce their church membership, and 5% of the population were no longer formally members of the church as a result. So, despite Nazi repression, though, the Nazis never managed to completely silence or crush the confessional church. However, most of those members were not saying that they were putting themselves in direct opposition to the regime wanting to overthrow it, but just that they were being loyal to the church and just trying to resist state interference within the church. Now think about some examples of Protestant opposition during World War II then. Now, a key opponent of the Nazis from the Protestant church was Bonhoeffer. We've mentioned him already. He was one of the founders of the Pastors' Emergency League, which then became the Confessional Church as well. And he was seen as a threat to the Nazis, hence why they banned him from publicly speaking in 1940. But he was still able to, form effective opposition by doing things like building links to the non-communist elite circles, and he was part of some of the Kreisau Circle meetings. However, he was arrested in April 1943 and executed shortly before the war ended in April 1945. So in terms of other examples then of Protestant opposition, a really key one to know about is October 1943, with the private memorandum that was issued to the Nazis directly by senior confessional church leaders. Now, this was private. This wasn't like von Galen's ones read out at the pulpits. It's not read out to congregations. They were very careful about the way that they worded this about injustice. They were basically referring to deportations of groups like Jews, but the letter that they wrote was deliberately vague and avoided explicit condemnation of their policies. So this was a morally significant moment when it comes to opposition. This is a direct criticism to the Nazis themselves about Nazi policies and trying to get them to change their mind essentially through this small bit of pressure. However, it's not politically effective, but it is a crucial form of opposition because it's an example of an institutional act, not just one or two individuals, but actually, the kind of the coming together of the confessional church. So, reasons for the limited reach then of this memorandum. Even with a formal statement and prominent figures, Protestant resistance suffered from fragmentation. Remember that there is a real issue for the Protestants with the fact that they're not one united church like the Catholics are. There were lots of different branches of them. They were fragmented, and they struggled with trying to get the majority of the Protestants on their side, because the majority of Protestants had actually supported the Nazis in the first place, and a lot of them saw themselves as German Christians and liked the Reich Church, and also a lot of people feared the Gestapo as well. So essentially, there are some examples of episodic mobilization, essentially, of individuals kind of opposing the Nazis for moral reasons, but there is no sustained nationwide campaign from the Protestants. We're now going to think about Catholic opposition, and we're going to start with a recap of pre-war Catholic opposition from 1933 to 1939. Now, remember that the Roman Catholic Church was generally seen as being in a better position to be able to oppose the Nazis more effectively, because they were a more united, centralised church, and obviously they had more of a tradition of independence from the state, and they also took direction from an international figure of the Pope. Yet it did try to come to terms with the Nazi regime. If you remember, in July 1933, there's the Concordat Agreement, where basically they agree to stay out of politics as long as Hitler leaves the church groups and schools alone. Obviously, Hitler starts to go against his word and starts attacking the Catholic churches because he wants to weaken their influence, by doing things like banning crucifixes in church, all those sorts of things. So between 1935 and 1936, some Catholic priests started to speak out against Nazism and started to basically criticize the fact that the Nazis were doing things like banning church youth organizations. But the Nazis didn't respond to this well. They just put increasing pressure on the Catholic Church, making it more difficult for them to hold on to their members by doing things like making the Hitler Youth compulsory. So they had less of a kind of hold on young people as a result. Now, the Pope was very upset about what was going on with Germany, so he wrote a papal encyclical called With Burning Grief or With Burning Concern that was published in 1937. Now, this is a really important form of opposition because it's the one time that the Catholic Church placed itself in open conflict with the Nazi regime. Basically, this was a letter that condemned the Nazi attack of the Catholic Church, not about wider conflict or wider condemnation of the regime. So what did this lead to? Just like before, more repression essentially. The Gestapo started to spy more on church organisation. They started closing down some of the Catholic churches, seizing their assets, and then closing all Catholic schools by 1939 as well. Now, this didn't achieve everything that the Nazis wanted it to, because with the Catholic Church being under attack, many older Catholics, particularly in rural areas, showed strong support by attending church services more regularly than they had, and so church attendance went up in some areas. So now we need to think about Catholic opposition during World War II. So first of all, it's important to note that the church generally supported the war. They basically supported the war aims, even the June 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union, and therefore opposition to the Nazis rested largely with individual bishops who spoke out about particular abuses rather than sort of mobilizing a church-wide movement. Now, if we think about some examples of some very brave Catholic opponents of the regime. So the first one to know about, an absolutely crucial one, is von Galen, who you can see pictured here. Now, he had found out about the euthanasia program that had begun in 1939. And in 1941, he basically delivered a pulpit denunciation of that program, where he told people about it, this program that was supposed to be secret, and was saying obviously about how horrendous and unchristian this was. Now, as a result of these protests, he basically helped force a temporary suspension of the killings. And the Nazis did temporarily stop it, and then they continued it again in secret afterwards. And that is a really effective form of opposition. The fact that he was at least temporarily able to achieve that is a significant form of opposition, especially for an individual. Now, the Nazis obviously wanted to arrest him and kill him, but they felt that they couldn't do that during the war, especially at a time where, they've just decided to invade the Soviet Union. They need the people to continue supporting the war effort, especially as they were so reluctantly loyal at the start of it. So instead of punishing him, they instead punished people who basically circulated that sermon. So, for instance, they killed 3 other Catholic priests for the sermon rather than von Galen himself. Another good example of a Catholic, an individual Catholic that stood up, is Archbishop Joseph Frings in Cologne. Now, he basically publicly condemned the killing of prisoners of war, adding an explicit law of war dimension to Catholic criticism. Again, this was very much an individual personal episode rather than being something that's a coordinated attack by the Catholic Church. This man, Joseph Frings, also protested against Nazi policies towards Jews and called them an injustice that cries out to heaven. He was constantly monitored but not arrested, as the Nazis were basically worried it would provoke mass arrest, just like they were worried about with von Galen as well. So his popularity and public standing protected him. So if we think generally about why was the Catholic influence restricted? So first of all, it is important to note that the Catholic hierarchy did have the potential to achieve more. There is a lot of criticism that maybe they could have done more than the Protestants, being united as one church, and having that international support as well. But they didn't fulfill it. A lot of people argue that's because there was a patriotic desire during World War II not to undermine the war effort, and also because they had seen about the reprisals for people that stood up to the regime, and therefore they wouldn't want to put themselves in open conflict with it. So it was essentially left to individuals like von Galen and like Archbishop Joseph Frings as well. Moving on to the next group then, we have political opposition from the KPD and the SPD. Now, if we're thinking about this sort of early pre-war opposition, they were expected to basically be able to mount the stiffest resistance to the Nazis. The Nazis were worried about them at first, and we can see that in the way that they quickly tried to deal with the left-wing threat. However, the left didn't really pose much of a threat because of their internal divisions between them and the fact that they often attacked each other rather than actually working together to try and defeat the Nazis. So if we think about the difference then between the SPD and the KPD, so the SPD, had been a crucial party for Weimar democracy. They wanted to operate within a legal framework. They opposed the Nazis with the Enabling Act in March 1933 and were the only political party to do so. But then they were crushed by the Nazis afterwards. They were outlawed in June 1933, and thousands of them were arrested when it was made illegal to be a member of that party. The SPD organised a base in Prague and then published Sepada reports, which were basically these reports that were commenting on the public mood in Germany. They also tried to distribute underground leaflets and tried to start a whispering propaganda campaign. The KPD, they ended up being tarnished, obviously, with the Reichstag fire brush. Basically, with van der Lubbe, they said that he was a communist who was trying to start a revolution, and therefore that allowed them to be targeted by the Nazis straight away from the 27th of February 1933. By the time we get to the end of that first year, 10% of their members are estimated to have been killed. Now, they did try to create an underground network and communist cells, but these were quite limited due to their fear of discovery. 2/3 of their members had been arrested, and therefore there wasn't very much trust between people, and it was therefore difficult to organise widespread resistance. They did, however, set up the Red Orchestra, which we'll come back to in a minute, which basically planned to send information to the Soviet Union, but that was destroyed in 1942. Now, generally, we've got a quote from a historian here of Puka, who emphasises that there were a lot of structural weaknesses of left-wing resistance after 1933, and therefore it wasn't a very serious threat to the Nazis. So let's now look at political opposition during the war from the SPD. So the SPD was obviously worried about being arrested. A lot of the members of the SPD had gone into exile before the war had even started. But those that remained in Germany were operating in very small micro cells of generally between 3 and 5 people. They couldn't really trust many people. Obviously, the Gestapo was so well established and so feared at this point that everything they did had to be very small scale. They were doing things like circulating illegal texts and newsletters and doing things like listening to BBC radio broadcasts as well and spreading anti-Nazi propaganda. Their methods at this point are non-violent. They basically want to undermine Nazi claims of popular support. They're not organising, an outright rebellion. They know that they won't be able to achieve that. Meanwhile, the leadership in exile, the Sepada, focused on intelligence and advocacy for a democratic post-Nazi order. They basically realised that what they needed was a military coup, that they weren't ever going to be able to motivate the workers to have some sort of substantial revolt, that terror was basically too ingrained at this point. So the SPD essentially provided continuous ideological opposition and maintained some resistant links throughout the war. However, because of the use of repression, because their leaders were in exile, and because they didn't have significant unity and they weren't able to be widespread, it meant that SPD opposition had a limited practical impact on the Nazi regime. So generally, they were more worried about survival than actually having active opposition. Now, I want to be clear that this is not the SPD themselves. This is an individual, a socialist individual, who wants to carry out an assassination attempt. So in November 1939, there's a socialist worker, George Elser, who planted a bomb in a beer hall where Hitler was supposed to be speaking. However, the bomb went off after Hitler had left that beer hall, and instead it killed 4 people, not Hitler. So we're now going to think about the KPD and what the communists were doing in World War II to oppose the Nazis. Now, they'd already really struggled. We've seen already by the end of 1933 that 10% of their membership had been killed. The majority of their supporters had basically been arrested and put in concentration camps to do hard labour. And the Gestapo had been really effective in the 1930s at severely weakening their attempts for underground resistance. Now, they also struggled from August 1939 when the Nazi-Soviet pact was signed, and that seemed very difficult to get people to support opposition to the Nazis when actually the Nazis and the communists who they were getting direction from have signed this pact of outward cooperation. However, support for KPD opposition was revived after the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. And generally, the KPD are seen as being better prepared for underground work, used to not working within a democratic framework in comparison to the socialists. So what did they do then? They issued leaflets attacking the regime. They operated in underground cells in cities like Berlin and Hamburg. And they also had groups like the Red Orchestra that we'll come back to in a second. However, they were effectively suppressed by the Nazis. The Nazis and the Gestapo destroyed many cells, many of these underground cells, and by the end of 1943, they had managed to destroy 22 of the 89 cells in Berlin. They also struggled to have very much widespread support due to that pressure from the Gestapo, but also the association with the Soviet Union, which reduced their appeal to ordinary people during the war against the Soviet Union that was seen as a real ideological struggle, and people wanted to be patriotic. So if we then think about the Red Orchestra as an example, because this is a good group to know about and to make sure that you know for the exam. So this was essentially a collection of resistant networks active between 1938 and 1942, which consisted of lots of anti-Nazi Germans, including communists and also Soviet spies as well. Essentially, this group are different to the just general underground networks because they engage in things like espionage and also relaying military secrets back to the Soviet Union, as well as disseminating anti-Nazi leaflets like the underground cells were. Now, this network provided intelligence on German war plans and things like troop movements. So it was all about undermining that war effort and ensuring that Germany lost the war, essentially so that they could then take over Germany after the Nazis had been overthrown. In 1942, because they saw it as such a significant threat, the Gestapo put a lot of resources into cracking down on this network and arrested over 122 members and murdering 50 of them. So it mentions about some of the leaders of this who were then executed. The Nazis falsely labelled the group as a Soviet spy ring to try and discredit their resistance effort. And despite the fact that they did obviously carry out some espionage and sending some of those military secrets back to the Soviet Union, it was wider than that and was kind of more about general communist opposition as well. Support your analysis of political opposition in World War II, you could use this quote from Kershaw if you agree with it, or you could even disagree with it in an exam answer. Now, he's talking here about dissent, and just a reminder that is basically somebody that is holding or expressing different opinions to the majority, or different opinions to those that are officially held, for instance, by the Nazis. So Kershaw argues that much left-wing activity should be seen as dissent rather than resistance, because basically he's suggesting that it didn't build a mass movement under the Nazi police state. It wasn't effective resistance, and really he's suggesting that a lot of the left-wing activity is just them expressing a different opinion to the Nazis. It's up to you whether you agree with it or not. Now I'm going to move on to the final group. Now, these aren't even listed in the textbook under opposition in World War II, but I think it is important to know a bit about worker opposition as well. So, opposition from workers pre-World War II then, it wasn't as widespread as you might have expected it to have been. The trade unions, who were really powerful in Germany under Weimar, surprisingly didn't really resist the Nazis, and official union resistance very quickly crumbled after the formation of the German Labour Front in May 1933. Remember, that's one of the things that Hitler used the Enabling Act for. Now, one way that the workers showed opposition to the Nazis was through doing things like strikes. There were 250 strikes in 1937, mostly in industrial areas, and they were basically always responding to poor working conditions or low wages. The Nazis responded harshly and even arrested people who went on strike as well. Workers also showed opposition to the Nazis by being absent from work and also doing things like sabotaging machinery. Now, that was a big enough issue that the Nazis had to make both a criminal offence, showing that this was widespread enough for them to essentially comment on this. Now, generally, the workers had lots of small-scale actions, but no large organised resistance. They had the numerical, but not the organisational strength to resist. And to be honest, there wasn't even that significant desire to resist from the workers either. Remember that a lot of workers were grateful just to even have a job after the Nazis' battle for work policies and after the impact of the Great Depression. And also, a lot of workers did like the benefits that they got through things like the Strength Through Joy organisation as well. So, despite the fact that they had worsening conditions, they generally didn't want to topple the regime. They weren't willing to get involved in that sort of level of opposition. We're now going to go through the impact of the war on the workers and how that affected opposition. Now, the reason that I wanted to include the workers in the first place is there is a really good example of worker opposition and about the Nazis responding to that opposition as well. So, in September 1939, the Nazis issued the decree of the conversion of the whole German economy onto a war footing. Now, this essentially imposed wage reductions, and there was a ban on payment of bonuses for overtime, for not having more payment for Sunday work, and also night shift work as well. And this caused widespread discontent, which was shown by the increase in the levels of absenteeism. Now, the Nazis then responded by reversing the decision a month later in October 1939. They didn't fully reverse all of the changes. For instance, they did bring back bonuses, but they said that wages were not allowed to increase to pre-war levels. So that is a really good example of where the workers opposed a Nazi policy, very passively, but still did, and the Nazis actually relented. It's one of the only times that the Nazis are basically having to listen to criticism from an opposition group or from their general public as well. In November 1939, don't forget that there's the example of a socialist worker who planted a bomb in a beer hall that went off after Hitler left and killed 4 people. He was arrested and executed for that in 1945. Now, generally, as defeat loomed from 1943 and certainly by 1944-1945, the German people experienced severe hardships in those final years, and there was a growing mood of disillusionment. Now, the majority did remain loyal. The workers as a whole were not opposing the Nazis, but some individual workers did take things like unauthorised absence from their jobs or didn't work as hard as they were encouraged to do as a way of expressing their dissatisfaction with the regime. Therefore, there was some worker opposition during the war, but it was largely economic and passive. The SPD leaders themselves even concluded that they couldn't get the workers to have a mass worker revolt, and instead they needed a military coup if they were going to ever take over. We've gone through all the key information on opposition from different groups in wartime. What we're going to think about now is a summary and some judgments that we can make about this for an exam. It is really important that you have your own views about who formed the most effective opposition and what were the most effective forms of opposition as well. So do make sure that you've made a judgment on each group. So first of all, let's think about the impact of war on opposition. There is a clear gap between the propaganda images of a German population united behind the Führer in support of the war effort and the reality of growing war weariness that's reported by the SD. There are declining living standards as a result of the war. There's increasing pressure of work, and that the hardships that people had to endure under the Allied bombings had certainly had an impact on them. It had eroded the belief in victory for some and tarnished Hitler's image. People no longer believed that he was this military genius that was going to lead them to victory. There was a mood of growing scepticism, especially from 1943 after the defeat of Stalingrad and the start of total war measures. There's indications that the Nazi Party actually lost support during the war. For instance, there's fewer people attending meetings or participating in their activities, and party membership also fell. However, there were still enormous obstacles facing opposition. Despite the fact that people weren't necessarily super happy with the Nazis, it doesn't mean that they actually significantly opposed them. First of all, most Germans did remain loyal to the regime. A lot of Germans viewed any plots against the Nazis as treason, especially amid wartime nationalism. For instance, after the July 1944 bomb plots, a lot of people were relieved that Hitler managed to survive from that, and obviously those reports are Nazi reports, but are reflecting that sense of relief that people had. There were also groups that could have been the focus of opposition that had either been banned or compromised themselves by cooperating with the Nazis. So essentially, even if there could have been widespread opposition, there wasn't, whether that was down to them either being banned and therefore finding it very difficult to organise effective resistance, like the KPD, or people that kind of compromised themselves by cooperating with the Nazis at the start. For instance, the churches. The Nazi police state also managed to reduce opposition because they were highly effective. They managed to use terror and propaganda and surveillance, which proved sufficient to contain dissent, at least for the majority of people. And it's often opposition wasn't necessarily going to be a significant threat to the regime trying to overthrow them, but actually had more significance from a moral standpoint. So if we think about some opposition like the White Rose Group or von Galen's opposition to euthanasia, even though it wasn't likely to topple the regime and it didn't intend to do that, we don't want to limit how profound we think that is, because it is still significant opposition, even if it's just from a moral viewpoint rather than the ability to overthrow the Nazis. So an overall judgment then that you can agree with or even disagree if you want to. But what I would suggest is something like, during World War II, opposition to the Nazi regime existed across German society, but it was fragmented, limited in scale, and largely ineffective in threatening Nazi rule. Whilst there was a range of groups, political, social, military, religious, and youth-based, they demonstrated dissent or resistance. None of them were actually able to mobilise mass support or seriously destabilise the regime, especially under the conditions of total war and intense repression. It would be a good idea to look up the 6.4 shot answer test on Teams and make sure you know these key facts and figures from this unit. What to do now, there's some suggestions here of what you could do, but I would definitely think about planning out an exam question. This one here is a really good example of a question that could come up, so create at least a 5-minute plan on it if you can. Also, don't forget you've got your dark pink source booklet, which has lots of source questions on opposition, so you could even have a go at planning some of those. Okay, well done for listening.